Hello everyone, I'm Becky Goldsmith with Piece of Cake Designs, and I want to show you how to do a cutaway stem. There are several of them in the blocks in Fresh Picked Posies. The one I'm going to concentrate on today for this demonstration is this branched stem right there. Now I've already made the templates for the block, and specifically the template that I'll be using here. This is the number 2 stem. You don't use cutaway applique for every shape. You use it for pieces that are particularly narrow or very small. Sometimes we use cutaway applique on pointed pieces. What makes this a nice candidate for cutaway applique is that if you cut this out, if you trace it on your fabric and cut it out with a 3/16 inch seam allowance all the way around, it's going to be harder to handle because the two sides of the branch are going to want to pull apart from each other when you're pinning and possibly sewing. You're likely to get some fraying in here that you wouldn't want. It's harder to hold on to than it is if you leave it with a buffer of fabric around it. When we do cutaway applique, we leave something like 3/4 of an inch of fabric all the way around the outside of the shape, and in this case we would leave the fabric intact between the two sides of these, between these two branches. So I would take the branch fabric and place it right side up on my sandpaper board. I would place the template on the diagonal grain of the fabric because the diagonal grain is less likely to fray and it turns under more gracefully than the fabric does when it's on the straight of grain. Now, since we're using the cutaway applique technique on this, I would not want to bump this up too close to the edge of the fabric. I want to leave it so that once traced, I can cut this out, leaving 3/4 of an inch all the way around it, and that would include at the ends of the stem. Okay, I've already traced this and cut it out, and it looks like this. Notice that the fabric is intact between these two parts of the stem. I would finger press this before positioning it on my block, and to finger press it, you turn the drawn line to the back of the shape. You should not see any chalk on the front. All of the chalk should be on the back. You don't need to spit on your fingers or scrape this with your fingernail or use a little iron. You certainly don't want to lay it down and scrape against it. It gives you too hard a crease in the fabric. But any edge that's going to be turned under and sewn gets finger pressed. So I've already finger pressed the inside lines and the other line here on this side of the stem. So this piece is ready to position. So let me set this aside for a moment. I'm going to put my sandpaper board back down because I like to have that underneath my background when I'm positioning my applique pieces. Often when you do this, you're working on a tabletop that might be slick. And if you've got your background on top of the sandpaper, it keeps the background from shifting as you're manipulating the fabric into place on top of it. I've got my overlay already prepared, and my background, I didn't mention this, but I've already pressed a grid into my background. I've pressed in a horizontal and vertical center line that match up with the center line that's on the pattern. Now I'm positioning this branch right here. So what I want to do is get my overlay lined up with my pressed in grid. And you can't see me doing this, but I'm leaning around this camera, so it's a little bit of a trick to get my hands in position to do this. So if it looks awkward to you, that's why. So I've got my overlay in position. I'm going to lift it up. Now, especially when you're positioning this largest shape, let me give you a little tip. What I like to do is identify 2 points that are relatively far from each other, and I get those parts of the applique piece lined up with the overlay first. Once you get that, everything else falls into position. So I'm going to look at this point right here at the end of the stem and this bottom point over here, down here somewhere. It's down there. Okay. So first I want to get that end in position, and then I'm going to get the bottom point in position. I need to move it up some. So I'm working with it until it all lines up. Once you get those points that are pretty far from each other in position, the rest of the edges of the applique line right up. Oop, I've moved my overlay in picking it up, but you can see, I hope, how that is. Once you get this in position, remove the overlay carefully so you don't shift it out of position. And then I'm going to pin. And because I'm right-handed, it will be easier if I turn this sideways to run my pins in. So I'm going to put my first pin in the base of this stem, right there. I don't want that to shift out of position while I'm getting the rest of this pinned. I put my next pin at the farthest point from my first pin. So that's going to be down here. Now I'm going to begin sewing this at one end, and then I'm going to work my way up to here. I will stop and knot my thread and begin again over here. So I know that when I sew this side of the stem, I'm going to sew it before I even come close to sewing this next side. I want to make sure that my pins are parallel to the line I'm going to sew and 1/4 inch away from it so that there's room to turn the seam allowance under. When I sew this side, I will be starting here, because this will be rotated. I'll be starting here and sewing around. I'll sew the inside of that V next. I want to make sure that my pins are parallel to that line and 1/4 inch away from it. Now I know it looks like this pin is in the wrong place, but I'm going to be turning under and sewing that line first. If my pin is too close, then there's no room to turn the seam allowance. Once I get to this end and knot my thread and am ready to start again on the other side of the stem, I won't need this pin anymore. I can take it out, and it will have done its job holding that stem in position until that's this side of the stem until I get to it. Once I've gotten the 3 points that are farthest from each other pinned in place, then I go back in and start filling in with more pins until I would have the whole thing pinned. I don't put just a few pins in an applique piece. Linda and I both feel strongly that you should have your applique firmly pinned to your background so that you don't shift it out of position while you're working. You don't want your applique to shift because you want it to be, you want it to lay flat against the background. And if it shifts out of position, it can pull and stretch. So I would go through and pin the entire piece the same way I'm pinning these pieces, these parts of the stem. So I would continue pinning all the way down here. Notice down here at the base of this stem, my pins are more in the middle, but they are still parallel to the side I'm going to sew first and 1/4 inch away from it. Get some more pins in. I love these little 1/2 inch sequin pins. They stay out of your way pretty well when you're sewing. Your thread may hang up on them a little bit, but not as much as if you're using longer pins. Granted, they're a little tricky to learn how to use at first, but they're not that tricky. You can do it. I have faith, and you will enjoy these pins if you learn to use them. Once you get the stem pinned in place, take your thread, bring this up, and bring the needle up at the beginning of your line. The bottom of this stem is covered by the vase at the bottom of the block. So I'm not going to want to start sewing way down here. I want to start right at the beginning of that line. Whoop. Got to get a grip on my pin, or my needle. I'm going to pull that up, get that out of the way. I like to bring my thread up and then trim away the fabric. If you would like to trim your fabric and then bring the needle up, that's fine. So I'm going to trim this away, leaving a 3/16 inch seam allowance. Follow the contour of your stem. Remember that the chalk is part of the seam allowance. So the seam allowance is measured from the inside edge of your chalk line, not the outside edge. Then I would begin turning under my fabric with your needle or your toothpick or your fingers, whichever works the best for you. And then I would sew, needle turning under that edge and invisibly appliquing it in position. Just like that. When you get to the end here, you would knot your thread, bury the tail of the thread underneath your applique, turn this. By then you're not likely to need many of these pins, but I wouldn't take them out until you really have to take them out. If you take these pins out too soon, your applique can move to the side and get a little bit ripply. So leave the pins in until till you need them gone. Once you're ready to begin sewing on this side, you would trim away the inside V. Sew down here, you'll turn your inner point, sew back out, knot your thread. By then you would be sewing in this direction. You would sew to here, knot your thread, bury the tail of thread on the back side of your applique, and then begin again over here, bringing your thread up, cutting away the excess fabric, sewing to the end and knotting your thread. And that is how you do cutaway applique. It's a very nice way to handle stems that would otherwise be hard to hold on to, hard to pin, and just generally difficult to sew. I hope you enjoy that, and happy stitching!